July 1941. The Channel sky shimmered with summer haze as a squadron of Spitfire Mk Vs climbed from their bases in southern England. For many of the pilots, the Spitfire was more than an aircraft, it was a symbol of survival. Just a year earlier, this sleek machine had carried Britain through its darkest hour, standing alone against the Luftwaffe. But on this morning, the men were flying into a storm they did not yet understand. From across the Channel, a new predator waited. The Focke-Wulf 190A, Germany's latest fighter, was faster, more powerful, and armed to the teeth. When the two squadrons clashed, the battle was over almost before it began. Spitfires that once danced through the air were suddenly sluggish targets. RAF pilots returned shaken, whispering the unthinkable: the Spitfire had been outclassed. German pilots laughed. To them, the myth of the Spitfire was finished. The once feared guardian of Britain was now an easy kill. In briefing rooms, Luftwaffe officers dismissed it with a grin: the Spitfire is obsolete. For the young British pilots who strapped themselves into the Mk V, those words cut deep. They were flying a legend, but legends do not always win battles. Every scramble carried the weight of doubt. Could they survive against an enemy that now seemed untouchable? And yet, in the workshops of Supermarine and the test bays of Rolls-Royce, a quiet revolution was underway. Engineers were preparing a new answer, an aircraft that would arrive not with fanfare but with vengeance. In 1942, the Spitfire Mk IX rolled onto the runway, and when it took to the skies, the laughter died. This is the story of how the Spitfire was humiliated, how it clawed its way back, and how the Mk IX restored the balance of power in the air war over Europe. And before we dive in, I'd like to invite you to stay with us, and to subscribe to the channel. Here we uncover not just the famous battles, but the hidden turning points, the overlooked machines, and the stories behind the legends. If you love discovering the moments when history could have gone either way, this is where you belong. Because the Spitfire's journey is more than a tale of metal and engines. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments of doubt, innovation and determination can turn ridicule into respect. So let's step back into the skies of 1941, when the Spitfire's legend seemed broken, and see how the Mk IX changed the battle. The story of the Spitfire is one of the most famous in aviation history. For many, its very name conjures images of 1940, the summer of the Battle of Britain, when squadrons of young men in blue uniforms dashed to their aircraft as the sirens wailed, climbing to meet the dark wave of German bombers crossing the Channel. The Spitfire, sleek, elegant, with its elliptical wings cutting the sky like a blade, became more than a machine. It was a symbol, a rallying cry, a reassurance that Britain was not yet beaten. By the end of that fateful summer, Britain still stood. Newspapers plastered photographs of Spitfires across their front pages. Winston Churchill's speeches spoke of the few, and to the public, the Spitfire embodied that phrase. Veterans would later admit that, in truth, the more numerous Hurricane bore much of the burden in 1940. But perception mattered, and the Spitfire had become legend. When young recruits entered the Royal Air Force in 1941, many dreamed only of one thing: to fly the Spitfire. To strap into its cockpit was to join the legacy of the men who had saved Britain. In training mess halls, they whispered its name with reverence. For those lucky enough to sit behind its controls, the experience was transformative. The Spitfire seemed alive, quick to respond, eager to climb. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "It was like wearing wings." By 1941, production had surged. The new Spitfire Mk V became the backbone of fighter command, rolling off British production lines in the thousands. It featured an upgraded Merlin 45 engine and new armament options. In numbers alone, it gave Britain confidence. Squadrons stretched from Scotland to the Mediterranean, and from the outside, it seemed the RAF now commanded the skies. But war is never static. Across the Channel, German engineers were preparing something that would shatter that illusion. The Luftwaffe had learned bitter lessons during the Battle of Britain. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, though formidable, had struggled against the Spitfire. Germany needed something better, faster, stronger. In the design halls of Focke-Wulf, Kurt Tank and his team were working on an aircraft that would surprise not just Britain but the world. That aircraft was the Focke-Wulf 190A. Its first appearance was like a slap across the RAF's face. Reports came back from 1941. RAF patrols encountering a new German fighter that climbed away with ease, rolled faster than anything they had ever seen, and carried heavier cannons. Pilots in their Spitfire Mk versus found themselves outpaced and outgunned. What had once been an aircraft of superiority now felt suddenly fragile. One squadron commander recalled, "The first time we fought the 190, we couldn't believe it. We had always believed the Spitfire was untouchable. But in a matter of seconds, that illusion was gone." Losses mounted. Combat reports filled with alarming notes: unable to catch, outclimbed, enemy disengaged at will. RAF pilots who once carried themselves with quiet confidence, now walked back from their sorties shaken. The Spitfire Mk V, the supposed pinnacle of British aviation, was being left behind. And in German mess halls the laughter came. Luftwaffe pilots, flying their new 190s, openly mocked the Spitfire Mk V. To them it was yesterday's fighter, an outdated relic. One German ace was quoted as saying, "The Spitfire is finished. It is no longer a challenge." The pride of Britain had become, in their eyes, little more than target practice. For Britain the realization was painful. Pilots rode home in frustration. Some wondered if they were being sent into combat with inadequate tools. The public, shielded from the worst reports, still believed the Spitfire was supreme, but in the skies over France the truth was grim. And yet not all hope was lost. Because in workshops across Britain, engineers were already searching for answers. At Rolls-Royce the Merlin engine was being pushed to new limits. Supermarines designers studied the Spitfire's airframe, convinced it could still carry more power, still fight if given the chance. It was a race, between despair and innovation, between German confidence and British determination. The stage was set. The Spitfire Mk V was faltering. The Luftwaffe was laughing. But a new Spitfire was coming, one that would silence the mockery and remind the Germans that legends do not die so easily. Autumn, 1941. Over the Channel, Spitfire squadrons rose into the pale sky to escort bombers on circus raids. The concept was straightforward: send small bomber formations into occupied France, force the Luftwaffe to respond, and engage them over their own territory. In theory it was a way to keep the pressure on and train new pilots in combat. In practice it became a nightmare. For the men strapped into their Spitfire Mk versus, every mission carried a gnawing uncertainty. They still believed in the legend of their aircraft, the same machine that had been celebrated in the summer of 1940. But when the first formations of Focke-Wulf 190s appeared, sleek and menacing, the illusion shattered. The battles unfolded quickly, brutally. Pilots who tried to turn inside their opponents found themselves outrolled and outclimbed. Those who attempted to dive away discovered the 190 had the speed to chase them down. Cannon shells burst like sledgehammers against the Spitfire's frame, and what had once been a duel of equals turned into one-sided hunts. Imagine the feeling of a young RAF pilot, perhaps barely 20 years old, straining against his controls as a 190 slipped behind him. He knew the Spitfire's strengths, its agility, its grace in the turn. But none of it mattered now. He would throw the stick hard over, desperate to escape, only to feel the aircraft resist, sluggish compared to the predator on his tail. A burst of cannon fire, a jolt through the airframe, and the cockpit filled with smoke. Another Spitfire lost. Another pilot gone. Reports flowed back to fighter command. Enemy aircraft superior in climb. Spitfire unable to match roll rate. Losses heavy. Commanders read them in silence, knowing the truth they could not yet admit to the public. The Luftwaffe had seized the advantage. For the Germans it was intoxicating. Pilots swaggered in their ready rooms, boasting of victories. To them the Spitfire had become prey, no longer predator. Jokes spread that the once feared British fighter was now little more than target practice. One German ace is said to have grinned after downing a pair of Mk versus in a single sortie. The Spitfire is yesterday's news. But for the RAF the laughter across the Channel cut deep. Morale began to fray. Squadron diaries reveal frustration, even bitterness. Pilots wrote home, lamenting that they were being asked to fight with outdated tools. Some wondered aloud if Britain could hold its edge in the air at all. The painful months of 1941 and early 1942 were more than just a technical setback. They were a psychological blow. The Spitfire had been the embodiment of defiance, a national icon. To see it humbled, outmatched, mocked was almost unthinkable. And yet, in the hangars of Supermarine and the engine bays of Rolls-Royce, a quiet determination burned. Engineers studied combat reports with grim intensity. They knew the MKV was falling behind, but they also knew the Spitfire's story was not finished. Its airframe still had life, still had potential. What it needed was more power. What it needed was transformation. The Luftwaffe laughed, but Britain was already sharpening its answer. In early 1942, the pressure on Britain's aircraft industry was relentless. The Luftwaffe had gained the upper hand with its new fighter, and every week of delay meant more RAF pilots shot down over France. Within fighter command, urgency turned into desperation. Something had to be done. At Supermarine, the team pored over blueprints of the Spitfire. The MKV, with its Merlin 45 engine, was stretched to its limit. Any more demands and the airframe risked buckling under stress. And yet, the engineers refused to give in. The Spitfire's design, elegant and resilient, still held promise. The problem was not the wings or the fuselage. The problem was the heart. The solution lay with Rolls-Royce. 4 months, its engineers had been developing an upgraded Merlin, the 61 series, featuring a 2-stage supercharger. It promised a leap in power, especially at higher altitudes where the Luftwaffe often struck. If this new engine could be married to the Spitfire's frame, the balance of power might yet shift. But time was short. There was no opportunity to design a brand new airframe. The RAF needed an answer now. And so, in workshops and hangars, mechanics worked feverishly, bolting the new Merlin 61 into the familiar Spitfire fuselage. It was, in some ways, a stopgap, a temporary fix until something better could arrive. But when the prototype roared down the runway, it was clear, this was no half measure. The Spitfire Mk IX was born. On paper it was meant as a stopgap. In reality, it became one of the most important fighters of the war. The increased horsepower transformed the aircraft's performance. Suddenly, the Spitfire could climb faster, dive harder, and, crucially, hold its own against the dreaded FW-190. The first time RAF squadrons took the Mk IX into combat, the effect was electric. German pilots who had grown used to chasing down Mk Vs found themselves surprised. The prey fought back. Spitfires that once fell behind now held the line, matching them in climb and meeting their dives with ferocity. One Luftwaffe pilot reportedly exclaimed after a dogfight, "That was no Spitfire V, that was something else." The laughter was beginning to falter. For the RAF, the change was immediate and profound. Pilots who had entered combat bracing for defeat suddenly found themselves fighting on equal terms. Confidence surged. Squadron logs that once recorded bitter frustration now carried a new tone, relief, even triumph. Imagine the feeling of a young pilot who just weeks earlier had prayed to survive his sortie, now looping into the path of a German 190 and finding that, for the first time in months, the advantage was his. Bullets hammered into the enemy's fuselage. The 190 spiraled downward, smoke trailing. Over the radio, a cheer broke out. The Spitfire was back. It was not a total victory, not yet. The FW-190 remained a formidable opponent, and the air war was far from over. But the balance had shifted. The stopgap had worked. And the Germans, who had laughed at the MKV, now realized they were facing a very different Spitfire. The Mk IX was not elegant in its birth. It was born of necessity, hammered together in workshops where engineers knew failure meant more lives lost. And perhaps that is why it succeeded. It was a fighter forged in desperation, sharpened by urgency and proven in battle. The ridicule of the Spitfire was fading. In its place grew respect, and soon fear. The first summer of the Spitfire Mk IX was a revelation. Squadrons transitioning from the weary MKV felt as though they had been handed their pride back. The difference was not subtle. Pilots climbed steeply into the sky and marveled at the raw pull of the new Merlin 61. Where once the aircraft strained to keep pace with the Focke-Wulf 190, it now leapt toward altitude with a vigor that felt almost alive. Over the channel, the Luftwaffe was quick to test the newcomer. In late 1942, a patrol of Spitfire Mk IXs tangled with FW-190s near the French coast. The Germans moved with their usual confidence, banking hard, rolling out of dives, expecting the British fighters to lag behind. Instead, the Spitfires held on. One slipped into firing position, tracer streaking past a 190's wing. Another broke through the enemy formation, climbing with a speed that shocked even its own pilot. The engagement ended with both sides claiming victories, but in the RAF briefing room afterward, the mood was unmistakable. For the first time in over a year, they had met the 190 on even ground. From that moment, the laughter began to fade. Word spread quickly among squadrons. Pilots traded stories of the new Spitfire with something close to awe. "It feels like the old days again," one man wrote in his logbook. "The Hun doesn't toy with us anymore." Where once they had dreaded contact, now they sought it. For the Luftwaffe, the change was unsettling. Confidence that had bordered on arrogance began to erode. German pilots who once grinned at the sight of a Spitfire now looked twice before engaging. Dogfights that had been comfortable victories became dangerous, uncertain duels. Reports trickled back to Luftwaffe command. A new Spitfire, faster, more powerful, capable of holding its own. The element of superiority was slipping away. But the significance of the Mk9 was not only tactical. It was psychological. 4 months, RAF pilots had carried the burden of inferiority, knowing they were flying into combat at a disadvantage. That weight was lifted. Squadrons that had grown cautious regained their aggressiveness. In the air war, morale mattered as much as machinery, and the Mk9 restored both. The Spitfire's legend, battered but unbroken, was reforged in these duels. By early 1943, more and more Mk IXs rolled off the lines, replacing Mk Vs at frontline squadrons. Each new arrival shifted the balance further. By spring, the RAF could contest the Luftwaffe not with desperation, but with confidence. And that confidence translated into boldness. Fighter sweeps grew larger, bomber escorts pushed deeper, and the RAF regained its willingness to take the fight to the enemy. The Spitfire Mk9 was no miracle weapon, but it was enough. Enough to erase the sneers, to silence the laughter, to prove that the Spitfire story was not finished. The Luftwaffe had underestimated Britain before. Now they were reminded why that mistake could be fatal. By 1943, the skies over Europe were changing. Where once the Luftwaffe dictated the tempo, the balance was shifting. Spitfire Mk9 squadrons were now firmly embedded in fighter command, and the results were undeniable. Missions that in 1941 had ended in frustration and heavy losses now carried a different tone. Spitfire formations climbed high above the bombers they escorted, engines humming with steady confidence. When the first German formations appeared on the horizon, dark specks growing into sharp-winged predators, the British pilots no longer felt the knot of dread that had haunted them. Instead, they gripped the throttle, ready to meet the challenge. The clashes were furious. Dogfights spiraled across the Channel coast, twisting and rolling through broken clouds. This time, though, the outcome was not predetermined. The Spitfire Mk9 held its ground. Against the FW-190s, it could match their climb. Against the Messerschmitt Bf-109G, it could often outturn and even outrun them. German pilots, once so eager to engage, began to fight more cautiously. For the RAF, it was more than just parity. The Mk9 allowed them to press deeper into occupied territory, to accompany daylight bombers farther, to mount offensive sweeps that forced the Luftwaffe to defend its own skies. Each successful sortie chipped away at German air superiority. And then came 1944. The stakes had never been higher. The Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord. Every aircraft, every squadron would play a part. The Luftwaffe, though battered, remained dangerous. If they could disrupt the invasion fleet, if they could strike the beaches, the cost in lives would be catastrophic. The Spitfire Mk9 would have no greater test. On the morning of June 6, as dawn broke over Normandy, the sky was alive with Allied aircraft. Hundreds upon hundreds of fighters, bombers, and transports stretched as far as the eye could see. And among them, weaving protective patterns, were the Spitfire Mk IXs. They flew low over the beaches, strafing German positions. They climbed high to ward off enemy fighters. They escorted lumbering bombers that hammered German strongpoints inland. Wherever they were needed, they appeared. The aircraft that had once been laughed at, dismissed as too weak, too slow, was now an essential guardian of the invasion. And the Luftwaffe? Their presence that day was a shadow of what it had once been. When German fighters did appear, they were met by Spitfire wings bristling with determination. The duels were short, decisive, and often ended with German aircraft tumbling in flames. The Mk9 had done more than hold the line. It had helped ensure the skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. The laughter that had once echoed in Luftwaffe ready rooms was gone. In its place was silence, frustration, and the dawning realization that the war in the air was turning irreversibly against them. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Years earlier, its pilots had strutted with arrogance, certain that the Spitfire was obsolete, a toy unworthy of serious combat. But now, those same pilots found themselves flying into a storm they could no longer master. The Spitfire Mk IX was everywhere. Over Normandy, over the hedgerows of France, over the advancing Allied columns pushing eastward. Its wings gleamed in the sunlight as it dove upon German convoys, its guns tearing into armored vehicles and supply trucks. Squadrons once limited to defensive roles were now predators, striking deep into occupied territory with impunity. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Messerschmitts scrambled from makeshift airfields, Focke-Wulfs rose in desperation. But the duels that followed carried none of the old certainty. Where once German pilots had laughed as they rolled away from the slower Spitfire Mk V, now they fought with gritted teeth, struggling to survive encounters with a machine that matched, and often surpassed, their own. For the RAF, every victory was more than a tactical success. It was vindication. Pilots who had endured the humiliation of 1941 now soared with renewed pride. In combat reports, phrases once filled with frustration were replaced with quiet satisfaction. Enemy driven off. FW-190 destroyed. Our loss is light. And the Germans? They no longer mocked the Spitfire. They respected it, and they feared it. The collapse of German confidence was not sudden. It came in increments, each failed interception, each lost ace, each sortie where fewer aircraft returned than had departed. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe units that had once laughed at the sight of a Spitfire now avoided combat unless forced. Fuel shortages crippled their operations. New pilots, rushed into service with little training, faced veterans in Mk IXs and rarely survived their first missions. The Spitfire, once written off as finished, had endured. More than that, it had triumphed. On the ground, Allied soldiers advancing through France and the Low Countries looked up to see the elliptical wings circling overhead and felt reassurance. The Spitfire was still there, still guarding them, still striking fear into the enemy. Its legend, reforged in the dark days of 1942, now shone brighter than ever. For the Luftwaffe, the laughter had long since died. The joke had turned back upon them. The aircraft they had mocked, the machine they had dismissed, had played a decisive role in their downfall. And as Allied forces surged toward Germany, one truth was undeniable. The Spitfire Mk IX had carried the weight of history on its wings, and it had not faltered. The war in Europe drew toward its brutal end. Cities burned, armies crumbled, and the Luftwaffe, once so dominant, fought in fragments, its squadrons scattered, its fuel tanks nearly dry. Yet through all of it the Spitfire remained. From the desperate days of 1940 to the rolling thunder of D-Day, from the humiliation of the Mk V to the redemption of the Mk IX, it had flown in every chapter of the struggle. What then does this story tell us? It reminds us that legends are not destroyed by setbacks. They are reforged in them. The Spitfire was mocked, dismissed, even laughed at by its enemies. But in the crucible of necessity it evolved. With new engines, new resolve, and the determination of those who flew it, the Spitfire transformed from prey back into predator, and in doing so, it helped secure the skies of Europe for the Allies. For the men who strapped themselves into its cockpit, it was more than just an aircraft. It was a companion, a weapon, and a promise that they were not flying into battle alone. And for the soldiers who looked up from the ground, seeing those elliptical wings above, it was hope. Hope that the enemy could be beaten. Hope that victory was possible. Today the laughter of Luftwaffe pilots at the old Mk V is nothing more than an echo of the past. The real legacy is written in the resilience of the Mk IX, and in the countless lives saved because of its strength. And perhaps that is the lesson for us all, that even when underestimated, even when mocked, with the right changes and the will to endure, transformation is possible. If you've journeyed with me through this story and you've felt the weight of history in these battles, I invite you to keep exploring. There are so many more untold stories from the skies of World War II, stories of machines, of men, of triumph and tragedy. So, if you found this video engaging, consider subscribing to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. Together we'll continue uncovering the echoes of the past, one story at a time.